Hello, world, and welcome to the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterlin, coming to you from the vacation destination known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and this is episode 61. There's going to be some strange, fun, but true stories all lined up through this week's podcast. We're going to start off with the wildest of restaurant story times. It'll be Restaurant Storytime 4, Murder on the Prep Room Floor. Stay tuned for that. We're going to follow it up with the story of the connection between former President Grover Cleveland and Cape Cod. We're going to go way, way back in the day and talk about what it was like as a kid reading Mad Magazine. We're going to have a brand new top 5 that are going to be my top 5 favorite childhood cereals filled with lots of sugar. We're going to have a brand new This Week in History and Time Capsule, all coming up right now on episode 61 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Welcome in, everybody. Happy St. Patrick's Day if you are Irish and you celebrate. I am Irish. I don't really celebrate because St. Patrick's Day is now typically a drinking holiday, and I'm not a drinker anymore. But for all of you that enjoy it and do it, I hope you have fun. This podcast is going up live on St. Patrick's Day, so if you hear it after, I hope you've recovered from your hangover. This is a big week, will be a big week, has been a big week. We got daylight savings has come around, so now the sun sets at 7. Oh, thank God. The only problem with that is even in March and into most of April, it may not snow anymore, but we get those gray, drizzly, 45-degree days that Cape Cod in the spring is known for. And the later sunsets just means we get to see more of that gray and fog and drizzle. Like I said, we got St. Patrick's Day. That was the day the podcast is dropping. Interestingly, too, this week, spring finally starts in a few days from when the podcast goes live. But even bigger is I'm going to be recording and filming next week's podcast and video podcast that you're all going to really be interested in. I'm so excited about it. Episode 62 is going to be a bonus episode, but it's going to be a special interview with Frank Durant, the director of the Lady of the Dunes documentary film that is debuting April 1st at the Cape Cinema in Dennis, April 2nd at the Provincetown Theater in Provincetown. We are going to be recording much of the audio as we walk the dunes of Provincetown out to where the body of the Lady of the Dunes was found. We will also be recording a 4K video interview from that spot and from other spots in town that are relevant to the case. So it's going to be a double whammy. I'm going to try to make it where the audio and the video are not exactly the same so that if you listen to one, it's not like you don't have to see the other. So the audio will go up next week. The video will probably be about the same, but I will obviously keep you informed about it on social media, Instagram, Twitter, and I'll put links so you can go to it. This is not going to be a murder-heavy podcast, although I just spoke about a famous murder case, but we're going to start it off with one of the most famous murders of my lifetime. That's a great sentence right there. Restaurant Storytime 4. Names are going to be changed to protect the innocent, but this is a 100% true story that you're going to have to hear to believe. So let's jump right into it now. Restaurant Storytime 4, Murder on the Prep Room Floor, here on episode 61 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Well, it's time for Restaurant Storytime 4, Murder on the Prep Room Floor. I had so much fun just getting the title ready. That's why this is like the king of all of my Restaurant Storytime stories, at least until I really think about more. But this is the one I wanted. When I thought of Restaurant Storytime, this is what popped in my head. But it needed to wait until part 4 for the rhyme because it's good cheesy. Now, this story is 100% true. And the thing is, I have to keep it vague with people. So the people that were there will remember it. The people that weren't there but might have worked with me at some point in time will not believe this was real. So we will preface this with 2 things. So where I worked for many years, starting in the early 1990s, we had a restaurant, we had a parking lot, And across the parking lot, we had a barn that functioned as a prep room with our walk-in and freezer, and then part of the barn where we had some dry goods. We had people stored their cars in there, and there were random little hallways and creepy rooms. The barn, though, was a double-edged sword. It was really a unique setup as far as working and doing food prep, but it was old, it was drafty, it had holes in it. So that all adds up to the fact that things would get into the barn. We had birds, we had mice, we had skunks, and we'll leave that there because this story does have to do with some sort of wildlife. Now let's dip over to the main protagonist of this story. For many years, we had a dishwasher who worked there at night. He was a nice guy, but he was quirky. He was kind of on the autism spectrum, more in the way of like Rain Man, the movie, where he was kind of a savant. He had a very strict way of doing everything. His dishes were always immaculate. He was arrived at the exact same time every day. He was someone that his quirks weren't anything distracting. They weren't anything that caused issues. And he was so good at his job that you could just set your watch to him. So now I've given you a bit of the backstory of the main players. So let's roll forward to this actual story that is 100% true. So I was not there this night when this happened, but I got all the stories from everybody who was there. It was a summer night in the mid-1990s. One interesting thing about the setup with the barn is the fact that sometimes when you would wash dishes, there would be things like next door there was a cheese grater, there was a meat slicer, things like that would have to get washed and brought across next door and put away. So this one summer evening, the dishwasher had washed whatever it was he had to wash, walked across the parking lot to bring it into the prep room, and when he opened the door to the prep room, he was caught with a big surprise. In the prep room was a full-size possum. I wasn't there, so I don't know if he was spooked. I don't know if fight or flight took over. I don't know what started this chain of events. So we'll leave you there. So the dishwasher is in the prep room with a full-size live possum. Our night prep guy was a summer guy. He was from New Zealand. Super nice guy, had the really cool New Zealand accent. He must have gone across the parking lot to either use the bathroom or get something to drink or something, because he had to return to the prep room after. So this part of the story is straight from this prep guy's mouth to my ears. So he walked across. The door to the prep room was slightly ajar, so he pushed it, walked inside, and there's an immediate room where you walk in that would lead you to the walk-in refrigerator and the freezer, and straight ahead of you is another room kind of in the back. So the back prep room there was a little bit obscured. So this guy walked past the opening to that prep room, and there is the dishwasher crouched behind one of the big round trash bins. And he is repeatedly stabbing this possum with a full-size chef's knife. And, I mean, just going to town on it like it was a Halloween movie. So the prep guy looks at him, and he was just like, what are you doing? And the dishwasher looks at him with this wild look in his eyes, with the knife, just blood all over it. And he then says to the prep guy, I had to do it. I had to do it. He picks up the possum. It's just blood dripping on the floor. The prep guy runs out, goes back all the way across the parking lot to just tell them what he has seen. And I kid you not, this is in the summer at night. So I'm sure the parking lot was full of cars. So back then, some of the servers and cooks, if they needed to, they would go out onto the deck and they would smoke outside. So there was a collection of people on the deck smoking. The prep guy came back over to start to explain what he saw. Not far behind him was the dishwasher carrying the knife and carrying the carcass, the bloody carcass of this possum, to show all of the other employees that are standing on the deck. And they were horrified that this just massacred animal. And I don't know if the dishwasher, if he didn't understand that they were freaked out or if he kind of enjoyed it, because he said he had to do it because it was in the prep room. But then he started stabbing it more, like jabs with the knife, to freak them out more. I know they all screamed and they made him throw it out into the marsh that was right next to the restaurant. And he ended up having to go back into the prep room and scrub the animal's blood off the prep room floor. And I know this for a fact because I had to work the next morning. And when I came in the prep room, you wouldn't have known that a violent murder of an animal had happened there. And that's when I got told the story. It's unbelievable. If I hadn't heard it, if I hadn't worked there, I wouldn't have believed it. That a possum was in the prep room and the dishwasher stabbed it to death on the prep room floor, then showed it off to everyone like a trophy. But he was a unique character, to say the least. He was one of those where you thought he was a dishwasher because he needed the money. But in reality, like I said, he was sort of like Rain Man, like a savant. And he had invested wisely in utilities. So his only vacation he would take every year was to go out to California and inspect his utilities. But we found out years later, his net worth was somewhere between $3 and $4 million, which means he did not have to do the dishwashing. He did it because he wanted to. And we would always make jokes with him that we were going to pretend to throw ourselves down the stairs and blame him throwing water out on the deck so we could sue him and get his money. And like I was saying, he was excellent at his job. Like, you could set your watch to him. He'd be there at a certain time. He'd kick ass washing the dishes, clean everything up and go. No trouble, no nothing. Until he decided it was time to retire. This is a little special bonus restaurant story time here. So this dishwasher, when he decided it was time to retire, it was over in that instant. This was another summer night. I believe it was July, a few years after the possum massacre. And he was washing the dishes during the dinner shift. And all of a sudden, this is totally true, he suddenly just straightened up and looked around and said, "All right, that's it." He took his apron off and walked out and never came back. He basically said, "Have a nice life," to the cooks that were there, to the servers that were there, walked out, got on his bike and rode home and never came back. It's unbelievable how he could just flip a switch and he was just like, "I'm finished." The cooks there were not happy. As he was thrilled that he was retiring, the cooks were pissed off that he just bailed in the middle of the shift in the summer. But that's Restaurant Storytime Part 4. This very unique dishwasher, killing the possum, retiring in the middle of a shift, having a net worth of $3 or $4 million, but doing dishes. He was definitely unique, and one that if I hadn't worked with him for years, I wouldn't believe he was a real person. But hopefully I'll think of more fun restaurant story time tales to share with you. I don't know if any are going to be bloody like this one, but I'm sure they'll be funny though. In the 20th and 21st centuries, it's been fairly common for presidents of the United States to spend time on Cape Cod. In more recent times, Barack Obama and Bill Clinton have taken vacations on Martha's Vineyard, while the most famous one is probably John F. Kennedy, who stayed at his family compound in Hyannis Port. Over the decades, several other sitting presidents have visited the Cape and Islands, men like Ulysses S. Grant, Theodore Roosevelt, and William Taft. However, when it comes to the summer White House, as it's typically called, there was a first, and it did not belong to John F. Kennedy. It actually belonged to President Grover Cleveland, who had a really deep connection to Cape Cod, and we'll dive a little bit into it right now. So Cleveland was the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms in office. He was elected to his first term in office in 1884, serving from 1885 to 89. In 1889, he was defeated by Benjamin Harrison, and he briefly returned to life as a private citizen. Grover Cleveland was a native of New Jersey, but his love of Cape Cod began during his first term as president. His family would rent a home in nearby Marion, just off Cape, and visit the Cape frequently with his friend, actor Joseph Jefferson. Jefferson was well known at the time for his role as fictional character Rip Van Winkle, both on stage and then later in one of the earliest motion pictures in 1896. If you go on YouTube and look it up, Rip Van Winkle, Joseph Jefferson, you can actually find that original footage. It's wild to see a movie from almost 130 years ago. So it was during these initial visits to Cape Cod that Grover Cleveland explored his love of fishing by making use of the Cape's ample waters. The summer of 1889 saw the former president gallivanting all across the Cape from Hyannis to Chatham by train. Cleveland and his wife Frances were falling in love with Cape Cod and wanted to be more than just vacationers. So in May 1890, after visiting Joseph Jefferson's summer home on Buttermilk Bay in Wareham, Grover Cleveland decided to make his dream a reality. He set his sights on the town of Bourne, near where he had enjoyed the fishing. The home, which he purchased for $20,000 at the time, or about $617,000 today, it laid along the Monument River at the end of present-day President's Road. That's easy to say. The home was built in 1880 and had been named Tudor Haven after the Tudor family which had originally owned it. Cleveland renamed the home Gray Gables and spent his first summer there in 1891. Despite his status as a then ex-president, residents tried to pull Cleveland into local politics. This was apparent in 1891 when debates raged over whether or not to build a bridge across Cohasset Narrows connecting Buzzards Bay to Wareham. Cleveland and Joseph Jefferson remained neutral in terms of the bridge, which ended up being built later that same year. The Cleveland family lost themselves in the laid-back lifestyle Cape Cod had to offer. But that being said, Cleveland's escapades on the Cape during his residency would be well documented in the newspapers, where they would constantly talk about where he was sailing his boat and how many fish he caught. In addition, when Ruth Cleveland, nicknamed Baby Ruth, was born in 1891, there were daily deliveries of packages and letters addressed both to baby and parents. So even though he enjoyed the simpler life, Grover Cleveland could not escape the celebrity of being a former president. And then in 1892, he was re-elected president for a second time. This meant Gray Gables became the first official summer White House on Cape Cod. Out of necessity that same year, a small railroad station was built about a half-mile away on Monument Neck Road to assure fast service back to Washington, D.C. for the president if he should need it. He also had a telephone line installed in 1892. The duties of the presidency would not stop Cleveland's love of Cape Cod, as he continued to find as much time as his responsibilities would allow to visit Gray Gables and Bourne. Cleveland served his second term from 1893 to 1897, retiring officially this time after leaving the White House. In addition to the beautiful summers spent on the Cape, memories were made with two children being born to Grover and Frances Cleveland during their time of ownership of Gray Gables. As the 20th century dawned, it appeared as though the Cleveland family would become even more deeply ingrained in the everyday life of Cape Cod. But two major events happened that would cut those dreams short. In 1904, Cleveland's daughter, Ruth, died of diphtheria at the age of 13. It was also around this same time that rumors began to swirl about the possibility of a Cape Cod canal being dug, which would pass through Gray Gables' backyard. Not wanting to deal with years of construction close by and heartbroken over the death of his daughter, Grover Cleveland made the summer of 1904 his last on Cape Cod. After that, the family would rent out Gray Gables. Grover Cleveland died in 1908, with his son Richard selling Gray Gables in 1920. It became a restaurant and hotel for decades before burning down in a fire in December 1973. And the story of the Gray Gables restaurant and bed and breakfast, that's big enough for a whole other segment on the podcast. So I'm not skipping over it. I'm just leaving room for that to be another part in another episode. The Gray Gables Railroad Station was purchased by the Bourne Historical Society and moved from its original location to the grounds of the Aptuxet Trading Post Museum in 1976. For decades, it sat near the actual replica of the trading post, but in recent years, it got moved out closer to the road so that it can be seen by people passing by, which is a neat little fact because right next to it, when you pull into the Aptuxet Trading Post Museum, there is a smock windmill which once sat on the grounds of Joseph Jefferson's summer home on Buttermilk Bay. So it's just so fitting that Cleveland and Jefferson, two things that were synonymous with them, are now close together on this museum grounds. Lastly, to really cement his legacy on Cape Cod, Cleveland Ledge Lighthouse was built in 1943. It sits 2 miles off the coast of Falmouth out in Buzzards Bay, and it's named for him, obviously, and sits in an area where Cleveland was purported to have gone fishing a lot. So when it comes down to it, there's been lots of presidents that have visited the Cape. Several have taken vacations here. There's been a few summer White Houses. The Kennedy compound is probably the most famous of all of these. But the importance of Grover Cleveland and his family and their connection to Cape Cod is apparent with so many places named in his honor, including the whole neighborhood of Gray Gables in Bourne. And the home itself, the Gray Gables home, not to leave you hanging, it's now a private home. A family bought the land and built a replica of the home. So if you go to where Gray Gables stood and look, it's pretty much an exact replica. But the main thing to remember is it's a private home, so you can get close, but keep a respectful distance and not go on people's property. Even I don't dare that one. But that is the story of Grover Cleveland, the first summer White House, and his impact when he was here and his impact after he passed away on Cape Cod. This week in history, we are going back 72 years, March 14th, 1950, and the FBI's introduction of the 10 most wanted list. This is still around today. It's the list of the top 10 most wanted criminals in the country. The seeds for this list were sown the year before in 1949 when a news story was released about the toughest guys that the FBI wanted to capture. That story was so popular that the following year, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, gave the go-ahead for the top 10 most wanted list. Since its inception, there have been hundreds and hundreds of different criminals on that list. Some of the most infamous criminals that have been on that list include serial killer Ted Bundy, terrorist Osama bin Laden, James Earl Ray, the man who assassinated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It all began, though, with the first man ever on the list, Thomas James Holden. He had been a criminal for 20 years before making the list. He was a train robber, but he eventually got caught when he killed his wife and her 2 brothers after an argument broke out. It was only mere months after he made the initial FBI's most wanted list that he was caught thanks to a tip from a man in Oregon. And that shows that ordinary citizens have had such a huge hand in apprehending these dangerous criminals. All in all, there have only been 10 women ever on the FBI's most wanted list. The first one was Ruth Eisman Shire, who was added in 1968 for her hand in a really nasty kidnapping where she kidnapped a woman with her boyfriend and buried her alive. The young woman kidnapped was the daughter of a millionaire, so they asked for $500,000 in ransom, but they ended up finding her and digging her up, so she lived. She's still alive, but Ruth was captured in 1969. She was paroled in 1973 and deported back to her home country of Honduras. Typically, when it comes to this list, the only way to get off of it is if you die or are captured. There have been very, very few individuals on the FBI's most wanted list that have been removed because they're not seen as a threat anymore. It's very rare. Since its debut, more than 150 of the criminals on the list have been captured thanks to tips from ordinary everyday citizens. Those on the list must have a lengthy criminal record and current charges pending against them to make the list. That's why it's a select group. And that group got its debut 72 years ago this week in history. And now it's time for a brand new time capsule. We are going back 46 years ago this week to the bicentennial year, St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, 1976, to see what was going on in the world back then. The number one song was December 1963, Oh What a Night by the Four Seasons. This song was different from typical Four Seasons songs where Frankie Valli was normally the lead singer, but on this song, drummer Jerry Polci sung the lead and Frankie Valli sung the bridge parts, and even bass player Don Ciccone singing parts of it too. So it was a collaborative effort vocally. This song was off of the band's album Who Loves You. The song ended up topping the charts for 3 weeks and actually had a long dance remix that came out in 1988 but was re-released in 1993. And I remember it from my high school dances, and that remix actually spent as long on the charts as the original did. The number one movie was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This is a comedy drama that stars Jack Nicholson as a new patient in a mental institution. It's an all-time classic listed at number 33 on the American Film Institute's list of top 100 movies ever. It swept all 5 major categories at the Oscars and made more than $163 million on a budget of just over $4 million. And if you need more of a reason to check the movie out, it has a 93% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. The number one TV show was Starsky and Hutch. This was a classic 70s cop drama with David Starsky teaming up with Kenneth Hutch Hutchinson to protect the citizens of Bay City and included their informant Huggy Bear. It began in April 1975 with a pilot episode that was a movie, and then it lasted 4 seasons and 93 episodes from 1975 to 1979. It starred Mark Paul Glazer and David Soul as Starsky and Hutch and was produced by Aaron Spelling, who produced other classic shows like The Love Boat, Dynasty, and ones from my generation like Beverly Hills 90210 and Melrose Place. And because it's St. Patrick's Day, or at least we're going back to that day, St. Patrick's Day, 1976, if you were out celebrating and you wanted to grab a 6-pack of beer to go hang out with some friends and enjoy St. Patty's Day, the average cost of a 6-pack of beer back then was $2.62, or about $12.95 when adjusted for inflation to today. And that's the average. I'm sure if you wanted some really crappy, cheap beer, you could have gotten it for less, much like you can do today. But do so at your own risk. And that's going to wrap up another This Week in History and another time capsule. Right now, we're going to dive into a fun top 5 list as I go back and remember some of my favorite childhood cereals, and that's coming up right now. Some of my top 5 lists are very easy to make. They take like a minute to get a good list together. Others are a little more difficult and they take a lot of time and actual research. This list falls kind of in the middle. It was easy to make, but it was hard enough to make that I'm going to have to make a second separate list. So what we're talking about here are my favorite childhood cereals. Cereal is great, and growing up in the 80s, it was even better, with high sugary cereals. In the early 80s when I was a kid, some of the cereals still had sugar in their name. But what I found is my favorites are all cereals that are still popular today for the most part. But I also had some that I enjoyed that were the forgotten ones that came and went. So at some point I will do top 5s of forgotten cereals, which I'm sure will be just as much fun. And like I say every time, these lists are in no particular order, so get ready because we've always got honorable mentions too. So the honorable mentions for childhood cereals include Fruity Marshmallow Krispies, Rocky Road, and Kix. And Kix made it on the honorable mentions because I would douse it in sugar to make it taste good. But the others, Fruity Marshmallow Krispies and Rocky Road, they were kind of the ones that came and went. And that was what got me the idea to do forgotten cereals in the future. So that'll be coming up. But we'll get you going here with the top 5. So top 5 childhood cereals. Number 1 is Corn Pops, formerly known as Sugar Pops when I was a kid with the porcupine on the box. Then they became Corn Pops when sugar became a dirty word. Little yellow round sweet puffs that when they were in the milk too long got wicked soggy. But the good part was if they got soggy, it was less effort to eat them. You could just inhale them. They're still around today, made by Kellogg's. You can't miss the box. They had those famous Gotta Have My Pops commercials in the 80s and 90s with the Jaws violin music with it. These have been a staple since 1950, so many generations have enjoyed Corn Pops. Number 2 is Honeycomb. Honeycomb is made by Post, and it's been around since 1965. The shapes of the cereal looks like an actual honeycomb that bees would make, like in their hive. Very sweet, larger than a typical piece of cereal, so you'd have to chew them unless you let them get really soggy. Honeycomb is one of those that it can come in the huge boxes, and I have been known to buy them in the past, the big boxes, and just eat them till I pass out. Well, not pass out, but there are certain cereals that come in giant boxes and others that you just can't find a big box of. So I enjoy the Honeycomb because it tasted good and you could get a lot for your money. In the 80s, they had the Honeycomb commercials where it was the kids in the treehouse and they would sing the Honeycomb is Big song. Like they had Andre the Giant was in one of the commercials. I think the recipe for it changed recently, but I haven't had it in a while. But it's always been Honeycomb. It wasn't like Sugarcomb and they changed it in the 80s. Number 3 is Count Chocula. Count Chocula is one of the monster cereals made by General Mills, and it first came out in 1971 along with Frankenberry. They had Boo Berry, Fruity Yummy Mummy. But Count Chocula is easily my favorite of that group and one of my favorite cereals ever. So much so that now it only is a Halloween time cereal where they'll release a limited batch. And every year around Halloween, I will make sure to get myself Count Chocula. It's the supply and demand. So if it was out all the time, I might not ever get it. But because it's only once a year, I have to have it. And these cereals, they had those cartoon commercials with the Count and Frankenberry, who was a pink Frankenstein, and Boo Berry. And those were always funny. It's easy to see how these cereals were targeted towards kids, especially when I was growing up. With all the commercials, I can still remember. And speaking of that, number 4 is Apple Jacks. These were also made by Kellogg's. They started off known as Apple O's in 1965, but were changed to Apple Jacks in 1971. And it was the cereal, it's still around. It's green and orangey brown rings, apple cinnamon flavor. The commercials used to be the kids in the 80s dancing around. A is for Apple, J is for Jacks, and they would dance around. Cinnamon crunchy Apple Jacks. Come on, kids of the 80s. You can hear it now. You're going to go see all these commercials when you get done listening and have wicked flashbacks. And finally, on my list of top 5 childhood cereals is Lucky Charms. And it's kind of fitting that this podcast will go live on St. Patrick's Day. So we have a lucky leprechaun with his cereal. It's been made by General Mills since 1964. Frosted Lucky Charms are magically delicious with Lucky the Leprechaun who would praise it to the kids in the commercials. They had the oat pieces that were sweet, but then they had all the different types of marshmallows and they would add marshmallows as the years went on. I love that cereal because you would try to pour into the bowl as much marshmallows as even though it was kind of evenly distributed. And you would eat most of the marshmallows first, or you'd eat the oats first and have the marshmallows soak up the milk. Oh, man, there was always a method to the madness. Any of those cereals that I just named on my top 5 list, Corn Pops, Honeycomb, Count Chocula, Apple Jacks, Lucky Charms, you could pop me down in front of a TV with a bowl of that today, and it would bring back all the warm and fuzzy memories of being a kid in the 1980s. And the best part is you can go have them all right now if you grew up in that time frame, or even today. Just go and grab a box or grab all the boxes and pour them together and make the super deluxe cereal. But I'll be back next time we do a top 5 list with something even more random and fun to give you all some crazy fun memories or make you think or laugh or whatever we do on these top fives. For more than 60 years, Mad Magazine spoofed everything basically in society and pop culture in America. It was an institution for kids and adults. I think the humor in it kind of transcended age groups and generations. I also think some of the humor, kids saw it one way and adults saw it another way, like the subversive humor and reflections on society at the time. From 1952 through 2018, when their original magazine pressing ended, Mad Magazine released more than 550 issues and loads of specials and books. So it was kind of a mirror held up to what was going on in the world for over 60 years, and you could see how it grew and evolved. For me as a kid, as we go way, way back in the day, I first discovered Mad Magazine thanks to my father and my uncle who had old issues and the paperback books that kind of had collections of spoofs and satires in it. As I went back to do the research for this segment, I was trying to figure out what the first issue of Mad that I remember seeing was. And when I go back, I think back to the December 1985 issue, which features Rambo on the cover, so Sylvester Stallone, with Ronald Reagan, the president at the time, next to him. That one seems to speak to me. I think that must have been the first new issue I saw. The great thing about Mad Magazine was the spoofs of whatever it was when it was movies, TV, etc. They would change the names to something funny that even kids like me, I would have been 8 years old when I first saw Mad Magazine, a new issue. For example, Rambo, in that issue, it was Dumbo. So it was First Blood Part 2 was that Rambo movie, and they called it Dumbo More Blood Part 2. And it may sound corny and cheesy, but it's one of those things that it was just different enough, and the childish type humor that would make kids my age and around my age laugh, but also would get deep enough into the satire of real world, more adult issues that people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s could enjoy it as well. The magazine itself was founded as more of a comic book in 1952 by Harvey Kurtzman and William Gaines. And at its peak, which was in the mid-1970s, Mad Magazine's circulation was more than 2 million copies. And that's a really good number when you think about it for a spoof-type magazine. But when looking at current magazine circulations, which I'm sure are different because digital, it would be placed about 20th. For those of you wondering, the highest circulation magazine is the AARP magazine, which kind of makes sense, with a circulation of over 23 million. Mad was known as much for the illustrations as it was for the actual text content. And they had a series of extremely talented content creators for that magazine. People like Don Martin, Frank Jacobs, Sergio Aragonés, Mort Drucker, and more, all pitched in to make this it was a must read. Even as a kid, I wanted to see the funny illustrations, even if I didn't always fully understand what they were talking about, because they spoofed everything. Think about from its creation in August 1952 was when the first comic book style magazine came out. Think of all the things that happened in the world from then to 2017-18 when they kind of shut down. Think of all the pop culture events, presidents, world events, movies, TV shows. It's all in there. Even if you never read Mad Magazine, you would know it based on its main... So it's sort of like their mascot, their main character, this young boy named Alfred E. Newman with that toothy grin, the big ears, the freckled face, the kind of moppy hair. He was on the cover of pretty much all the magazines from his debut in issue 30 in December 1956, where he was listed as a write-in candidate for president. From then on, he's been on every cover, and he's a pop culture icon. I also enjoyed the Spy vs. Spy comics, where it was the two spies that were basically like triangle face, and it was a white spy and a black spy, and they would just sabotage each other all the time. And it was just a running gag where they would find new ways to basically kill each other. They debuted in the January 1961 issue of Mad Magazine and basically continued ever since, to where they're essentially a standalone comic strip now. They're still going. Another really neat thing that Mad Magazine had that made it unique was the final page of the magazine would be a fold-in. So there'd be an image on the back, the inside cover of something, but if you folded it kind of in thirds, the image would kind of meet in the middle. I don't know if it was thirds or halves, but you would have to fold it properly and it would make a different image, something totally different. And it was really neat because it was that kind of subversive type humor. Some of it was in the words, some of it was in the artwork. That was spoofed in pop culture. The Simpsons, I remember, did it a couple times. There was an episode when Marge Simpson went to jail for shoplifting, and one of the inmates in there had her back tattoo was basically a Mad Magazine fold-in, where she put her shoulder blades together and it made a different face. And even Homer was trying to figure one out at one point, and he couldn't do it right, so he was laughing at a joke that made no sense. You knew that for the most part you were going to get something really funny if you bought Mad Magazine. And throughout most of their run, they kind of stuck to their principles. From issue 33, which was released in April 1957, all the way up through issue 402 in February 2001, Mad Magazine was produced ad-free, which I think gave them a little more leeway to make fun of everything because they didn't have sponsors. And so it kind of gave them free reign to make fun of everything equally, instead of if they were sponsored by Pepsi and then they would make fun of Coke but not Pepsi, and it'd be like, wow, it's because you're getting paid by them. So being ad free, they could just make fun of everything equally. But times changed and they had to switch it up and get some advertisements as the circulation started to dip in the 21st century. There are just so many things that made Mad Magazine fun and unique. Things like them begging you to buy the magazine on the cover, putting the price and putting cheap next to it. With the rise of the internet and digital magazines and YouTube, where you could find this type of humor so easy, I think it just ate into Mad Magazine's fan base. And a lot of their readers got older. I mean, I stopped reading it and when it turned into the 21st century. When I got into my early to mid-20s, the humor was still there, but I think as you grow, your tastes change. So slowly the subscription numbers dipped until issue 550, which was the end of 2017, marked the end of the first run totally new magazines. But for those of you that missed out on a chance to read Mad Magazine in its heyday, all is not lost. You can go to madmagazine.com. And within a few minutes of being on that site, you can get a pretty good grasp on what Mad Magazine was and is all about. But for me, as a child of the 1980s, a teen of the 1990s, there were few things that gave me more laughs than reading Mad Magazine and seeing the foolish shenanigans and the spoofs that I might have to ask my father about what it meant and why it was funny. And I'm sure a lot of young boys out there that, my age at the time had the same thing. It was kind of a connection with the family where your parents, uncles also read it. But I think that type of magazine in this day and age wouldn't fly because it will be so slapped with lawsuits. They got sued a lot when they were around back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So just imagine today that nobody can take a joke. So I think Mad Magazine was a product of its time, perfect for when it was out, but now its day is come and gone. But luckily, you can go back in the day too and read the old ones. They sell them on eBay. Go to the website. madmagazine.com, and poke around for a few minutes and see if I'm crazy to say that it was one of the best magazines to read, the funny text and images. Or maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm a product of the 80s too. That's going to wrap up episode 61 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Thank you so much to everyone who has been tuning in. Thank you to those that either have started listening recently or have been here from the beginning. However you found me, thank you so much for checking it out. Even after 61 episodes, I still get excited and look forward to the reaction that people will have to the new podcasts that are released. So I hope that this one meets your expectations. Come and find me on Instagram for my weekly live streams. They're called Without a Map, basically because I don't have any notes, and we talk about the most recent episode of the podcast, and then things go off the rails in a fun way. Lots of friends and family in there and a lot of regulars that stop in. It's a lot of fun. Follow me on Twitter. I post a lot of links and things for the podcast there. Subscribe on YouTube. I've got a lot of 4K New England videos, which are fun. I started those in the pandemic where I would travel places and film it so that if you were stuck inside quarantining, you could almost feel like you were outside somewhere else. If you ever have any questions, comments, suggestions, or just want to say hi, shoot me an email, christophersetterland@gmail.com. Visit my homepage, my website, christophersetterland.com. That is created, maintained, run by my oldest friend, Barry Menard, great graphic designer out of Rhode Island. If you ever need that kind of work done, he can do things that I could only imagine. Visit wearyourwishes.com. Get on their email list so you will be the first alerted when the store is back up and running as they restock and retool for 2022. Visit Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble to get your copy of Kiki's Cape Cod Kitchen. Learn how to cook like a master and be on the lookout because Crystal Joy Smith has 4 more books in production. So if you like Kiki's Cape Cod Kitchen, and you should, get ready because she's got more to come. It's a whole brand. It debuted a few months ago, and it's going to be just continuing. It's just the beginning. If you're in need of an adjustment, a realignment, a reconnection, come and visit me at Mind Body Spine Chiropractic on Route 6A in Brewster. Dr. Michael Singleton is a hugely talented and hugely knowledgeable, more than just a chiropractor. He can help set you on your way. He could bring you into the training room with myself or Coach KO. Kaylin Orr, you've heard her. She'll be coming back on here soon. And everything there is held together by Heather at the front desk. Stay tuned because very soon Cape Kettlebell will be debuting. There'll be a whole segment on the podcast about that. If you want to buy me a coffee, you can go to buymeacoffee.com, find the In My Footsteps podcast. Any donations go to advertising the podcast, and there's no pressure. I try not to do any heavy sales. If you want to donate to the podcast, you can. If you don't want to, just listen and share it. That's every bit as good. Stay tuned next week for episode 62. That is the special bonus episode. Like I said at the top of the podcast, it's going to be an on-location interview with Frank Durant about the Lady of the Dunes documentary. He's going to talk about what it was like to work on it, his feelings about the case, his feelings about finding me for the book, and a lot more fun stuff. So that's going to be a good episode next week. And now as springtime is debuting, making its return, hopefully everyone can get outside into the warmer weather, get that vitamin D. It is so good for your mental health. Winter, it wasn't super bad this year, but the short days, cold days, snowy days, they're not great for your mental health when you're trapped inside. So get out there and feel better and just lean into things that make you happy for your own mental health. That's what I do with this podcast. It makes me happy to share this. I hope it makes you happy to listen to it. And I appreciate all of you that do listen. Thank you so much. And remember, in this life, don't walk in anyone else's footsteps. Create your own path and leave the biggest footprint you can on this earth because you never know what tomorrow brings. follow your dreams, share the love, share your passion, and make time for those that make time for you. Enjoy the St. Paddy's Day if you're listening on the Thursday. Otherwise, have a great week, a great weekend, and I will talk to you all again soon.